I want to talk about how we get fooled into believing that predictions have been confirmed when really they haven't. Let's start with the Patreon question that prompted this train of thought. Then we'll divert into some discussion of technique and principles of how it's done, and then we'll come back to the specifics of the question. It was asked a couple of weeks ago, and it goes like this. Mallen, what are your thoughts on the threat to life alerts apparently being sent to all our mobiles next month? And since that conspiracy theory, which I have been aware of for a while, has now been confirmed by the BBC, what do you reckon to the latest one, that sometime in the near future a passenger plane is going to be shot out of the sky and the tragedy blamed on aliens? Every time I try to laugh at yet another CT, conspiracy theory, they keep coming true. Lab leak, 15-minute cities, digital IDs and CBDC, which I think refers to central bank digital currency, to name but a few. I once read a book by a noted mind reader, one Kenton Nepper, who explained for his audience of students of supposed mind reading the principles of the cold read. Techniques for how you'd go fishing for information while making it seem that you had read someone's mind, or sometimes you'd been told it by a quiet voice of a ghostly relative of someone present in the room, whatever the facade was supposed to be. It worked because people are inherently pattern matching. So they strongly remember matches, and they could be persuaded with linguistic framings to forget the misses. He'd established that nearly all problems people face can be boiled down to a few big areas: wealth, relationships, health. And you could start by probing in those areas. This problem you're facing, it's all about relationships. If the other person said yes, then that's great, and you follow up with a sentence beginning with and. And you do understand in your heart what's at stake in this problem, don't you? For instance. If the other person, however, said no, then you would follow up with a but. But don't you see how this problem is going to affect your relationships? Now, if you think hard enough, you can see how most big problems ultimately end up affecting relationships. So you would often get a, well, I guess I haven't really thought about it like that before, which would produce a sentence with an and. All the while, the subject becomes more and more convinced that you see exactly what their problem is, even though you have said nothing whatsoever specific about it that they themselves haven't already given you. Even if you don't get to techniques like that, someone who understands human psychology can nevertheless at least play the numbers game. So, for instance, supposing you want to make an initial impression on someone, make them think that you can read their mind. If you know something about human psychology, you'll know that if you ask the average person to think of a number between 1 and 10, a significant number will naturally think of the number 7. So you can go to your unsuspecting target, give them the spiel, you can read their mind, you can prove it, think of a number between 1 and 10, write down the number 7, and then confidently announce that that is their number. They will be astonished. You suddenly have someone whose mind has been opened to the idea that you have extraordinary powers. Do with that credulity what you may. But Mallen, you might say, even if a majority might say 7, not everyone will. And indeed, that is true. I expect there will be some in the comments below saying, I did it and I came up with 1 or 8 or 4. And only half of them are lying, but that's not the point. In that case, it becomes a numbers game. You just move on to the next person. The next person doesn't know that you just did it and got it wrong. All they will see is that you got it right with them. A lot of email scams work that way, of course. Someone has compromised your Barclays account. Well, I might look at that and think it's an obvious scam because I don't have a Barclays account. But for those that do, of course, they have an initial question mark because all they see is an email communication that knows that they bank with Barclays. Now, they didn't see the hundreds of thousands that went to people who did not bank with Barclays. They only saw the one that came to them, and it had a true thing in it for them. So, maybe it's legitimate. People remember, and they give weight to the correct information. The point with this approach is that you just have to be skilled at explaining away or glossing over the misses. Because if there are hits, people will remember them first. Even though the hits may have been in very general terms, people can be encouraged to record them as having been very specific in retrospect. And so it is that you can make predictions or observations in very general terms that have a high likelihood of touching a chord. So, suppose you want to impress a beautiful young lady with the idea you have a special insight into how she thinks. Can't imagine why you might want to do such a thing, but let's just say. You would say something like, the people around you think that you're really confident, but secretly you often have self-doubts that they don't realise you have. That can hit home with a profound impact. Wow, that's so true. Nobody else sees that about me, but you did. And you know why it works? Because if you stop to think about it, which your target almost certainly won't, of course, because we're so susceptible when we're talking about ourselves, it has a very good chance of being true for everybody. Any particularly good-looking person is going to have lots of people around them assuming that they're brimming with confidence. A lot of the time, that's probably because in certain contexts they really are. But who doesn't have secret self-doubt? The answer is no human being that ever walked the face of the earth. The suggestion, sometimes you're not as confident as other people think you are. It's not specific as to what the self-doubt is. It's not specific to when you feel it, just that it exists. Look for it in your memory, you'll find it. It sounds specific, it sounds personal, but it is one of the safest generalizations you can make about anybody. These are some of the techniques we have learned to use against each other, because they exploit things that we human beings naturally do. We are easily fooled by generalizations masquerading as specific insight, and we can be fooled into thinking that if someone's correct about one thing, they're more likely to be correct about other things. We don't intuitively wonder whether they were wrong before they were right, how many misses they had before they had a hit. That last one, by the way, often plays out quite innocently whenever something big happens, a financial crash, an unexpected election result. There'll be a small handful of people who predicted it. They will then get feted constantly for their wisdom, for their predictions on what will happen next, although almost never do they repeat the startling clarity that made them famous. And that's because, people are predicting all sorts of things, all the time. When something highly unexpected happens, it would be pretty unlikely that someone hadn't made some sort of prediction that sounded a bit like it. Usually those people get ignored and nobody much notices their wacky predictions that were so far off base. But when what they predicted actually happens, suddenly it seems hugely significant. Doesn't necessarily mean they have any insight whatsoever, and it makes it no more likely they'll be right about anything in the future. But we jump onto it. We place huge meaning onto it. The person who predicted the big crash says another one is coming. I mean, it's clickbait for the gods. Now, let's go back to the question that started this train of thought off. A conspiracy theory. which I have been aware of for a while," she said, "has been confirmed by the BBC, and to do with threat to life alerts being sent to all mobiles." But has it, though? So what the BBC has confirmed is that a new system to use mobiles to send citizens warnings in the events of major catastrophes, floods, fires, extreme weather, whatever it may be, is to be tested on the 23rd of April in the UK. A number of people are concerned about it because some will not hear that a test is about to be carried out, and what if they panic? What if they get this alert and they lose control of their vehicle or whatever mishap might follow? But is that a conspiracy theory? Well, no, that's just the government about to test a system, which kind of makes perfect sense. Whether they're going about it in a sensible way or not, you can be the judge. A little Googling, however, finds this story has grown into something else in at least some quarters of the internet. And I'm guessing some of this is what my questioner has been hearing and what she was referring to. I mean, I don't know, because she wasn't specific in the question. So, according to Vice, prominent truthers, whoever they are warning that the trial is part of a globalist plot and, quote, a precursor of what's to come. Do we think a precursor of what's to come is nicely evocative whilst also being conveniently non-specific? By the way, COVID lockdowns were once described as a precursor of what's to come. There were people saying that we would never be let out. Where were those people when we were all let out? By then, they had moved on to a new precursor of what's to come. And this is kind of how it works. People remember the hits, they quickly forget the misses, they move on to the next thing. But I digress. Conspiracist channels have been abuzz with chatter about the alert system, with users framing the trial as an effort to enforce public compliance and install spyware as part of a nefarious plot to bring about a dystopian new world order. Their concern has seen hundreds of online mentions of hashtags like hashtag phones off 23rd April and hashtag emergency alerts, as conspiracy theorists urge each other to change their phone settings to avoid receiving the alerts. I did a quick sanity check on those hashtags, and indeed there are still some of those floating around. Now, my questioner. Which version of this did you believe had been confirmed by the BBC? Think about how easy it is to start something like this off, because someone hears about something coming, an alarm test, could be anything, a new technology, a draft new law that's in the very first bill stage. And then they layer on statements from nowhere to suggest that it's part of the World Economic Forum, a globalist plot to take over the world. However you want to rationalise it, there's always a way. And then you hear the BBC say, yes, there is going to be a test. Yes, there is this new technology. There is this new draft law. And you naturally think, gosh, it was all right then, what they were saying. But was it? Another conspiracy theory come true? Well, no, the fact of the new thing was always true. But it doesn't constitute a conspiracy unless it's actually being done secretly for nefarious purposes, which was the second bit that was layered on. And nobody has confirmed that part because almost certainly it's absurd. Now, it doesn't matter. People who suspect something must be up. They will be pattern matching away. They will just remember the generalities. The thing was true. Now, you've given us a prediction for the future that is much more specific. A passenger plane is going to be shot out of the sky, and that tragedy will be blamed on aliens. Surely hard for that to be mistaken. And as written, as you kind of acknowledge, it's patently absurd. Why would someone conspire to do that anyway? I'm sure someone's come up with an answer to do with control, but it sure doesn't look like any of the short-term logic that's recognisable in the course of human history. Now, probably what happens is that along with all the other misses that you heard, it will fade away over time. You will just forget it, while you're busy latching on to the next one. If someone like an Alex Jones seeds 20 stories like that, it just takes one thing to happen that sort of looks like what they said, and they can jump onto it and say, see, I predicted that. And people will remember that one, forget the other 19, and say, see, that Alex Jones keeps getting his predictions right. Did they, though? Go back and look at the actual specific things they said. Did they actually predict it? Or did they just say some things after the event could be claimed? So for this one specifically, we have seen a handful of tragic occasions when a passenger plane has been shot out of the skies. The Russians over Ukraine, the Iranians. It's one of those exceedingly, thankfully, rare things that can happen. It's rare enough that it's startling and horrific when it does. So if out of the 20 such possible things that someone has seeded, tragedy strikes and it happens again, will it matter then that actually no, nobody's going to blame it on aliens? Or will it be enough that it happened at all? And then you'll be saying, they dismissed it as a conspiracy theory, but so-and-so predicted the globalists would shoot down a plane, and now this happens. Do you see how this works? Because the questioner gives a short list of things that she's noticed to date, things dismissed as conspiracy theories that keep coming true, you have to ask, do they though? On that list you had 15-minute cities. Are they a conspiracy that has come true? Really? There is a city planning concept for 15-minute cities. I've talked about it here before. It may be a good idea, it may be a bad idea, but urban planning isn't a conspiracy per se. The conspiracy came in when a bunch of people started saying that 15-minute cities were conceived by globalists to enforce climate lockdowns, preventing people from leaving their immediate neighbourhood. That has not come true. Again, it may be a terrible urban planning principle. It may well deserve to be opposed wherever local councils decide to implement it. I just have no strong opinions on that. Urban planning is not something that I particularly get interested by, except when I trip over egregiously incompetent examples of it getting in my way. Bad urban planning exists without the need for conspiracy. So does the fact there's a thing called a 15-minute city, is that all you need to make you think that everything said about that conspiracy was true? Digital IDs, these have been talked about since digital became a thing. Why? Because in principle, the efficiency and convenience of it makes it a natural thing to consider. Is there any evidence that politicians from Tony Blair onwards, who I think was the first one to raise it, did so because they were taking orders from the World Economic Forum to impose a new world order, or whichever of a dozen versions have been circulating? Of course not. There are genuine concerns, of course, that it can be used to curtail freedoms. That's why the proposals have been controversial, get vigorously debated, and were initially shelved. But that's a different point. Controversial proposals get debated. But the second a peddler of conspiracy theories spots something like that in the future, reads one of the early reports of some think tank arguing that it should be a thing, it's very easy and intuitive for them to jump on it and start putting claims onto it. Digital IDs are coming. It's how the technocrats intend to enslave you. The second part is pure speculation. Once you start looking for things lurking in the shadows, you can always find a few that will persuade you that it counts as evidence that it must be true. If I told you the globalists have sent a small army of snoops out to follow citizens and they're all driving green cars, probably start to notice suddenly there are green cars everywhere, which is weird because you're sure you didn't see so many before. So something's clearly is going on. The same applies to central bank digital currency. Of course, once digital currencies sprang up, Bitcoin and the rest, the most natural question in the world, if you work in a national treasury, is this something we should be doing a version of? The answer might well be no, but you're not doing your job if you've not asked the question. And again, very easy for people to allege that that is in some unspecified techie way all about control of the population. That part doesn't get proven at all. But suddenly there are stories in the press about governments considering digital currencies, and you think, aha! Another one that was obviously true. The trick with all of these things to notice, like the person who stuns you with their insight into your personality that you sometimes have secret self-doubts, is to notice that generalities are the things that are coming true and they mean nothing, and the specifics remain speculative and often nonsensical and have no evidence behind them at all. Those specifics that do spookily come true are the ones you're being directed to notice amongst all the other ones that didn't. It's just a numbers game. They will say things like, they are trying to do something, being conveniently vague about who they are. So when someone, out of approaching 8 billion people on the planet, when someone does something that fits that, they can point at them and say, aha! You see, one of them admitted it. And your pattern-matching brain sees it and thinks, well, yeah, they got that right. Hey, this is getting scary. But no, they seeded a generality. Then they pointed at any sort of specific they could find that had enough commonality with that you would think it was a direct match. Look at the detail of what was said in any of these predictions that you're asking yourself about. Ask yourself how likely it was the generality would at some point in the future, over the decades, come to pass. And if it does come true, go back and check the specifics of what was predicted. Maybe a passenger airline is going to get shot down in the next couple of decades. It happens. Extremely rarely, thankfully. But over the course of decades, may well. Will it officially be blamed on aliens? No. That would be truly remarkable. Will you remember that detail? Or will you think, a plane got shot down. Must have been the globalists because that's what was predicted. And if you think that, the students of Kenton Nepper, who learned all about the techniques of cold reading, will have scored yet another hit at the expense of all of our grips on reality. I would encourage you to learn more about the techniques that are being used against you. It's the first step to making yourself more resilient in the face of them. Remember, genuinely predicting the future in any meaningful, specific way, it's hard. Really hard. But falling for generalities masquerading as predictions, now that's really easy. Now at least you'll be a little bit more resistant to the games that people are trying to play.
Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.